Leadership for Black Communities. And I'd like to welcome you all to this very timely conversation, Black Vote Matters, exploring the shifting landscape of voting, democracy, and civic participation. This is a particularly necessary conversation as we're in the heels of the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. But then there's also an interesting moment in our world as we look at what's going on in Charleston, South Carolina. And because of that, because of the pain we know some of us are experiencing through that, we wanted to take a moment of silence just to recognize the lives of those impacted by the violent act in Charleston, as well as the violent acts that we've been living and enduring through over the past several months and obviously years. So take a moment. Thank you for that. I find this topic to be especially timely, and even thinking about what's going on in Charleston, given a last year or so, having to see Reverend Raphael Warnock at Ebenezer, the historically Black church, Ebenezer in Atlanta, having to go to a conversation on the cable channel to talk about the issue of legislation that was being passed in the state of Georgia around gun, allowing greater access to guns. The irony of that, of course, was because Reverend Warnock is in the midst of a church community that experienced its own gun violence when the mother of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered in the church at the organ a number of years ago. And those are the moments in history that we really don't realize, but they help to remind us that these incidents of violence are not unique. There's also the intersection of what does this look like when it comes to issues of voting rights, when it comes to the issues of us being civically engaged. So we're using this time to really take a deeper look at the fact that Black votes do matter, and we want to explore that with a very powerful panelist. So I'd like to invite our esteemed moderator, Alvin Starks, to take it away. Take it away, Alvin.
Thank you, Edward. Next slide, please. So I, too, want to take a moment to say thank you for everyone who is taking a chance to really spend time with us for what I think will be a very exciting and informative conversation about Black Vote Matters, exploring the shifting landscape of voting, democracy, and civic participation. Next slide, please. It is interesting to me, and I thought this was a very staring image. And I think it's one that we've probably seen a million times, and by a photographer that many of us probably don't know his name. This is a photography by Moneta Fleet, an iconic civil rights photographer. You've seen a lot of his work in Jet and Ebony. But it's also the lead image that we're using for this particular conversation. Partly because it gives us a sense of history, it gives us a sense of what's been accomplished and what still needs to happen. I think photography is one of those essential art forms that actually crystallizes, our own social justice ambitions. So I was glad to see that that was added to this conversation. Next slide, please. To give you a few housekeeping tips, your phones are muted during this webinar series. Questions and comments we'll be able to ask at the end of the presentations. We do ask you to also submit your questions and comments inside the GoToWebinar software. We will collect them during the conversations to make sure that we have a robust Q&A with the panel and the audience. So you've just heard from Edward Jones, the Director of Programs at ABFE. Next slide. We do encourage you to join the conversation on Twitter at #ABFE as well as Black Vote Matters. Also, Association of Black Foundation Executives is available on Facebook as well as LinkedIn, ABFE, a philanthropic partnership. Slide. And again, I am Alvin Lewis Starks. I will be the moderator for today's conversation, and I'm really thrilled to really have such an esteemed panel with us. I just want to offer a bit of an overview and a welcome. Next slide. So there are really 4 different parts inside this conversation. The first is a general overview of the conversation. The second part is a series of webinar presentations from our invited guests, which I think you'll find exciting and timely. Thirdly, we will do a Q&A with the panel. And finally, we will close with some comments and some next steps. Next slide. Edward reminded us that, in August 6th to be exact, the nation will commemorate the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act. Timely in its own fashion because many of us have been re-exposed to the VRA because of films like Selma, as well as watching the shifting tides of what does it mean to do voting work in a post-civil rights moment. Less than almost 2 years ago, VRA was actually overturned by the United States Supreme Court, which definitely redefines this notion of voter protection in the 21st century. And so, like many of us, activists as well as funders, this new renaissance around, so what do we do? What are the new aspirations that are needed to really instill the idea that, of course, black vote matters, but also what are the structures that must be reapplied or in place? Respectfully, we know that VRA is just one part of a much larger dynamic notion of civic participation, but it does allow us at least a touchpad to begin a conversation that will go on for quite some time. You will see on the screen a picture of the great Fannie Lou Hamer, what freedom means. And again, this notion that we have always been in the process of making our democratic values heard and seen and visible, not just within mainstream politics, but I think looking at civic engagement in a much larger framework, how we participate in civil society, even at the school board level, as well as in our local elections. So all of that material we know matters. Next slide, please. But what's interesting about today is that there are a number of issues that include voter suppression, new voting laws, and there's a lot of talk around potential political apathy, the connection of contemporary social issues and actually how that influences and shapes people's desires to vote. There's no way to kind of have this conversation and not consider the current moment of Black Lives Matter as well as the current events of the day. We also know that civic engagement means something different now than it did 50 years ago. In a growing multiracial nation, where do black communities fit? How are they heard? What are the constructive ways that funders can address these new ideas, these new complex but vitally important dynamics? We hope that this webinar will actually challenge you as well as offer some opportunities for your own philanthropic engagement. Next slide, please. In particular, there are several themes I think you will definitely walk away from. So one is actually understanding the changing racial and generational shifts in the U.S. Also understanding the importance of black female voters and their engagement. Ideas around how do we leverage the momentum from the current social justice actions to inspire civic engagement. And lastly, what are the challenges and opportunities within current rights and policy shifts? We talked about this as a shifting landscape because it truly is that. There are many answers. There are probably even more questions than we actually have answers for. But we do think that this is really relevant given whichever portfolio you might be overseeing. So those who might be overseeing an education portfolio or a youth organizing portfolio or even a geographically bound portfolio, we do think that the question of civic participation does meet your interest. Next slide. Another familiar image that we've seen over the last year in particular is the image of black youth doing hands up. This is an image from Howard University, I believe, which became very iconic and actually even thinking about voting as it relates to social media. and what are the next ventures into understanding social media. Next slide. So now I'd like to introduce our featured panel. We have several esteemed colleagues who I think many of you will actually know by their name. First, we will hear from Ludovic Blaine, the Project Director of Color of Democracy Fund, followed by Keisha Gaskin, the Program Director of Democratic Practice, U.S. at Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And lastly, we will hear from Austin Thompson, Director of Youth Engagement Fund at the Democracy Alliance. So next slide. I would like to bring Ludovic Blaine to the microphone. Ludovic, are you there? Next slide.
Yes.
Okay, Ludovic, you are on.
Great. So first I want to appreciate ABFE for pulling this webinar together. I appreciate Alvin for the invitation and appreciate everybody who's on here learning and questing and working to align the work that we have the privilege to do to try to make some real change. I want to acknowledge that on a day where hundreds of thousands of dark-skinned folks are getting deported from the Dominican Republic because they're too black to be Dominican, the day after the 21-year-old white guy killed 9 black folks in a church in a state that flies the Confederate flag, and a day that Justice Clarence Thomas was a swing vote when 4 justices voted to not allow a state to bar the Confederate flag. And today is the day before Juneteenth. It's a good day to have this meeting. And I also know that folks at the Black Lives Matter Network are also having a meeting today. So I'm glad that funders are meeting today and glad that practitioners are meeting today. And I hope that we can continue that kind of alignment. Next slide. Here's the reality of American democracy today. First, on the left, this is from the Women's Donor Network. Frankly, I didn't even get the maps on black folks because the numbers between white folks and people of color were staggering enough, and the black numbers are worse. But you can see the extent to which we are not a democracy. White men have almost 4 times the amount of political power that their numbers would detail in a real democracy. And when you look at how it plays out in a place like Ferguson, where the population is predominantly black and the elected officials are almost entirely white, that frankly looks more like South Africa of the past under apartheid than South Africa now, and that's where America might be going. So WDN found that out of 42,000 elected officials from president to the county level, 90% of them are white in a country that's 37% people of color. Obviously, merely having black elected officials is not sufficient for a robust and thriving black community, but not having them is certain doom. Next slide. So the first thing we need to do, and what's easiest to jump into, is reversing anti-democratic policies. I was going to put in there reverse traditional American anti-democratic policies because obviously America was built on not having black folks, on preventing black folks from voting. And here are some ways that have existed for the last couple of hundred years, and other bullet points on here are newer ways. First, on felon disfranchisement, serious 1 out of 13 African Americans are disfranchised because of state felon disfranchisement laws. Much of the work that's been done show that de facto numbers, meaning the numbers of people who are not legally disfranchised but have been told that they are disfranchised or have reason to believe that they are disfranchised, is actually larger. And then the number of folks whose votes are suppressed because they're in a household with people who are either legally or de facto disfranchised is quite large. And so some folks view the African American community, voting community, more like an immigrant community where there's a substantial number of folks who either actually can't vote or who think that they can't vote. It has political impacts. So everybody knows disenfranchised voters in Florida alone had been permitted to vote in 2000. Bush probably wouldn't have won. And in 2014, in 3 key Senate races in Georgia, Alaska, and North Carolina, as well as the Florida governor's race, the number of disfranchised felons was greater than the margin of victory. This policy is rooted in racist laws, and in many states in the past, who only allowed men to vote. Men who killed their wives were not disfranchised, but men who beat their wives were disfranchised because only men of color were picked up for domestic violence at the time. So there's a lot of racism in these policies. Next, on photo ID, cutting back voting hours, polling places, etc. This has been a specific right-wing strategy done in many, many states, and all of them have racist impacts. Still on the previous slide. Go back a slide. Redistricting and at-large elections have been key at state and local strategies to disfranchise folks. Oakland recently restricted protest rules where they prevented really Black Lives Matter folks from being out in the streets. They created a curfew, but other folks who were out in the streets were not captured by that curfew. And then in places like Detroit and even New York, there's been state takeover of cities, which means that even if folks voted for the mayor or city council, it actually didn't matter. There was an unelected, appointed group of folks making policy and financial decisions. Next slide. We all know that American politics is about race and wealth, which are intertwined. These slides are from Demos. This is the wealth gap in the country on the top. And the bottom is the racial composition of the donor class. So if the country is really run by donors to politics, this is where the policies are coming from. And this isn't about apathy. This is about systemic economic oppression. And so in many key ways, in an American democracy where economics and democracy are totally intertwined, working on economics is working on democracy. Next slide. So what are we going to do about this stuff? We need to go on the offensive and do that in 2 ways. Can you go to the next slide, please? So recommendations. First, building infrastructure to win. First, we need to, previous slide, building infrastructure to win, thanks. First, funders need to collaborate, coordinate, and align with other funders, just like we want our grantees to do within their sector. If we don't do that, we will be unable to do the rest of the bullets. Second is we need to make sure that our grantees take a 501H election so that they can do both C3 and C4 work with the C3 funds that they get. Next, we need to make sure to fund Black voter engagement work with a voter file, ensuring that robust Black groups are at our state C3 voter engagement tables. For those of us that have enough money, we should make sure that not only are those Black groups at the tables, but that they are at the core of the tables. Another piece is making sure that we are funding Black civic engagement work, which I think Austin will be and others will be talking about later, like Black Lives Matter. And the last is that we really need to fund the development of a Black progressive individual donor base. Those of us who work in philanthropy know that despite those of us who work in philanthropy, we really need more than philanthropy to move this needle, and it will take individual donors to do that. Next slide. The other pieces that we need to prepare for governing. It is really hard to win elections. It's actually harder to make it worth winning elections. First of all, we need to make sure that when Black folks, especially Black women, deliver votes for a candidate, they get credit and receive policy awards. For example, in 2013, women were credited with Virginia Governor McAuliffe's win, and much of the articles written were about what women policy preferences were. But actually, McAuliffe won 91% of the Black women's vote, and he lost white women's votes. So while it was numerically accurate, it was misleading to say that he won because of women. He actually won because of Black, Latino, and Asian women, and despite losing white women. And so the articles that should have been written and the black infrastructure in Virginia should have been pushing for is to say that he won because of black women, and here are their policy preferences. Second, we need a black-focused candidate training program. This is actually a C3 expense. Attendees to candidate training can be funded through C3 work as long as they have not determined or announced what they're running for. We actually have no explicit C3 black-focused candidate training programs, and so that is a key part. We also need national and regional black think tanks. My understanding is the Joint Center is broke, so we do really need to prepare to govern, and in order to govern, we need think tanks to make sure that we know how to do that. Another piece is around funding of progressive black elected official networks. There are some emerging networks of progressive state electeds, as in SIX, the State Innovation Exchange, and local elected officials, local progress, but they need to be more robust, and they need to cover the states where there are black folks. So essentially, whether it's black caucuses on those entities, on other places, we need to be funding explicitly progressive networks of black elected officials. And one thing I'd add, and then I'd wrap up, is we also need to be funding proactive election reforms. Much of what we'll hear on this webinar and in a variety of the calls is about the bad federal stuff that's happening and the bad things that are happening in states. However, we do have opportunities to push for good things to be happening in states where there is some liberal or progressive power. Those are largely, factually, blue states, states like Washington, California, New York, Connecticut, and a couple of others. In those states, we should be pushing to make sure that we move towards automatic voter registration, which is the new law in Oregon, and California is considering it same-day registration, which will be coming online in California in the next couple of years, pushing for things like making sure that the government itself actually encourages voters to vote, moving towards vote centers, and a variety of other things. So we do need to make sure we have not just a reactive, responsive agenda, but a proactive agenda. With that, I'll pass it to the next speaker.
Ludovic, thank you so much. Again, we encourage you to go ahead and write in questions that you have for the panelists. Around 2:50, we will open up to a general Q&A with the audience. But next, I would like to introduce Keisha Gaskins. Keisha Gaskins is the Program Director for Democratic Practice U.S. at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Keisha, are you there?
I am here.
Great. So I'll pass it on to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much. First, I wanna thank ABFE for allowing me to participate in this call and to share with all the colleagues and share this time with you all during this very important time. You know, as we think about our shifting demographics in this country, we also really need to think about issues around ballot access. What is the relationship between the rising American electorate and what has happened with African American voters, where the focus is on foundation support and some of that energy. And we're going to talk a bit in this presentation really about the status of the Voting Rights Act, what's going on with the Voting Rights Act amendment, some of the impact of restrictive laws moving around the country, talking about state voting legislation, both affirmative and restrictive laws, and then looking at some grant-making strategies. So we'll go with the next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, great. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. It was to ensure that local governments do not pass laws that deny American citizens the equal right to vote based on race. Clearly, the Voting Rights Act was a culmination of years of work by African American activists in this country to have a legal structure for the rights of black voters. The Sections 2 and Section 5 are the most important sections of the Voting Rights Act. Section 2 applies to the entire country and prohibits dilution of minority voting power. And then we also have Section 5, which applies to very specific jurisdictions as defined by Sections 3 and 4. We're going to talk about what happened with that in 2013 with the Supreme Court. And prospectively prohibits voting procedures, changes, or laws that discriminate against minority voters using a process known as preclearance. And preclearance was particularly important because unlike Section 2, which applies to laws that have gone into effect and voting rights changes, Section 5 applied in advance. It required jurisdictions to get pre-approved, as I said, or preclearance from the federal government before any changes, whether it was as simple as moving a polling location or as complicated as passing a new rubric or access around ballot access. Next slide. So the Voting Rights Act had moved forward up until 2013, and the one thing that I think we do have to remember is up until 2008, every Supreme Court decision related to voting rights had gone in a direction that expanded voting rights in this country and supported the expansion of the right to vote. In 2008, the Supreme Court rendered a decision called Crawford in Indiana, excuse me, and that said that Indiana's voter ID law was constitutional, and that was the first time since the court had been considering these cases since 1972 that the court had determined a restriction or a contraction of voting rights to be acceptable. And that trend continued up until 2013, where we saw the Shelby County decision. And in June 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, which removed a critical tool to combat racial discrimination in voting. In Shelby County, the court invalidated Section 4. And under Section 4, that was the formula by which it was determined which states were required and which jurisdictions were required to pre-clear any voting rights and changes. So this included a number of important states in the South, as well as specific counties in New York, including New York City, in New Hampshire, South Dakota, Michigan. So there were states not just in the South, but all over the country that had a defined history of discrimination over time that were impacted by their obligation to define these laws. And when this decision was overturned in 2013, you saw states like Texas, North Carolina, South Carolina pass laws that had previously been denied preclearance once the Supreme Court said that Section 4 was unconstitutional. Section 3. And this is important when we talk about the next section, which is the amendment to the Voting Rights Act. The bail-in provisions still exist. But it's much more difficult because under the bail-in provision, there must be a legal finding of discrimination for each jurisdiction before it's required to submit to the preclearance process. So unlike other places where if for the state of Texas having a preclearance obligation under Section 4, that meant every jurisdiction in Texas had to get any changes pre-cleared. Under Section 3, if the state of Texas is found to have to still submit to a Section 5 preclearance requirement, that does not apply to Texas counties, municipal jurisdictions, and each one would have to be bailed in individually. So it's still, although important and remains a tool, is very cumbersome. Next slide, please. In response, on January 16th of 2014, Representatives Conyers, Sensenbrenner, and Leahy introduced a bill to strengthen the Voting Rights Act, and this was the VRAA, the Voting Rights Act Amendment, and it required a jurisdiction with a recent record of Voting Rights Act violations to pre-clear laws, as Section 4 did, expanded the bail-in procedures, which allowed court to subject jurisdictions to preclearance. It made it easier to bail in more jurisdictions, creating a uniform requirement to inform voters of pending voting changes, and enhance the ability of lawyers to halt discriminatory election measures before they can harm citizens. Finally, the federal observers to monitor elections and ensure compliance with laws protecting rights of Americans who speak limited English. So the Voting Rights Act Amendment really was designed to strengthen the existing Voting Rights Act and to find a new coverage formula that would replace Section 4. Unfortunately, that bill died in 2014. It has been reintroduced in February 2015. There remain organizations that are focused very much on passing the VRA, and we can talk more specifically about what groups those are, but there is not a lot of hope that this law is going to pass, certainly prior to the 2016 election. Next slide, please. Thank you. There's another sort of trend that went on in our country. As I mentioned, we had the 2008 reversal of the Supreme Court that permitted highly restrictive laws to go into place. In 2010, we saw a massive shift in state control, moving from states that were purple, states that were blue, to going to red states around the country. And part of the challenge and what that meant was it meant a new wave of restrictive voting laws. And a number of these states had restrictive voter ID laws, elimination of early voting days, reduction in days of early voting, and in some cases elimination of same-day registration, removal of public financing for judicial elections, as we saw in North Carolina, and during that time, an extraordinary number of laws introduced and passed. So one of the things that's happened has really been how are we thinking about the impact and effect of these laws, particularly voter ID laws. I'm sorry, I'm going to ask that everyone mute their line. I think we're getting a lot of odd background noise. Thanks so much. That to really understand what was the effect and what were the implications. Certainly there have been a lot of studies, a number of studies, trying to say there has been an effect, there hasn't been an effect. But one of the most important reports came out of the Government Accountability Office that researched the effect of voter ID laws on Kansas and Tennessee. This was a very important research because it was also the ability to hold constant other factors that had been a real struggle to try and figure out how the vote was affected, had affected, populations in light of increased voter turnout overall for the 2008 presidential and other issues. So in looking at this research, GAO looked at Kansas and looked at Tennessee. And as of 2008, between the ages, among the residents, as of 2008, between the ages of 18 and 23, they were more affected by the ID laws than voters between the ages of 44 and 53. Registrants who had been registered less than a year versus registrants who had been registered 20 years or more were more affected by voter ID laws, and certainly African American registrants were more affected than white, Asian American, and Latino registrants. This report did not find consistent reductions in turnout among Asian American populations, Latino populations as compared to white registrants. This is suggesting that the laws did not have larger effects among these subgroups. That is to say, however, we do have to note that these populations are particularly small in the states that were examined in this study. Next slide, please. All right, so I want to take a little bit of time to speak about where we are with state voting legislation, and this is a graphic from the Brennan Center for Justice, and the full analysis link is here in the slide and certainly will be circulated. And so as I mentioned, starting in 2010, we saw a real shift in states really focusing on voting and access onto the ballot as political strategies. And so in 2015, there were released 113 bills that were introduced to restrict access in more than 33 states. During that same time period, there were at least 464 bills that would enhance access to voting. And a lot of these measures are the measures that Ludovic was speaking of earlier, right? So we're talking about greater access to the polls through early voting, same-day registration, automatic voter registration, of the kind that we saw in Oregon, but certainly others that are more expansive and don't limit registration simply to those who have a DMV record. And so there are lots of opportunities. So what we've seen as a trend, bills to expand voters' access to the ballot box have been outpacing those to restrict voting. The challenge, of course, is That's in terms of introduction, not necessarily in terms of passage. And we really still don't have a sense of how much we're seeing that much gain in those spaces. But because recent legislation has been very effective to make it harder for citizens to participate, pushback has been, it's not quite a tit for tat, but certainly the idea of advancing affirmative voting reforms is incredibly important in this area. Thank you. Next slide. All right, so as we think about the grant-making strategies in this space, when we are specifically talking about the ideas of protecting voter rights and expanding access to the polls, certainly legislative advocacy, expanding access to the ballot, voter registration modernization, and this also includes things like pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, expanding early voting times, establishing vote centers and that sort of thing. We also have felon reenfranchisement rules, right to vote ballot initiatives, and we're seeing more and more in different states around the country trying to establish a state-based right to vote that goes further and is more expansive than how the Supreme Court has interpreted the federal right to vote. There certainly is some not without controversy, but certainly is a strategy. Support for actually getting voters voter identification cards. There is also some recognition that we're not going to see a lot of retrenchment in these areas, that pushing back on some of these voter ID laws, particularly in red states, isn't going to happen. And there are a number of organizations, including Vote Riders and others, whose primary goal is simply to make sure we're getting IDs in the hands of voters. We're also seeing a lot of work in outreach in certain communities and populations. Finally, the National Voter Registration Act enforcement in terms of voter registration, also looking at not just DMV motor voter, but also looking at opportunities to make sure that federal agencies that provide support and services to individuals are following their obligation to actually register voters at that point of contact. And again, there's a number of organizations doing really good work in this area. As we think of defensive strategies, of course, there's litigation and litigation support. I did segregate these two because there are other strategies around litigation support that are trying to sort of backfill some of the role that was played by the federal government prior to the Shelby County decision, and making some choices about how we figure out where are we developing experts, how are we getting these databases together, how are we identifying plaintiffs when we no longer have this robust system of pre-reporting changes to election law. Certainly legislative advocacy at the state level and election protection activity on Election Day and around Election Day is also very important as we think about very specific questions on how to expand and support and protect voting rights and ballot access. Next slide, please. And finally, this is, again, a list of organizations that we believe at RBF are particularly important. In this case, this is not an exhaustive list, and we certainly can continue if we have any questions in this space to certainly think about which organizations are doing some really interesting work in these spaces and have done really important work around protecting the right to vote. And that's it for me, and we can turn to the next speaker. Thank you.
Keisha, thank you so much. That was excellent, and I look forward to asking you later on in the conversation. And again, I just want to remind folks that you're able to write your questions to us via the GoToWebinar software function. Next, I would like to introduce our last speaker. Austin Thompson is the Director for Youth Engagement Fund at the Democracy Alliance. Austin, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Take the microphone.
Awesome. Thank you, Alvin. And thanks, everyone, for joining us. My name is Austin Thompson, as was just said, and I'm originally from Georgia. And I remember when I was probably around 10 years old, the governor of my state, Governor Roy Barnes, decided to take the Confederate flag off of the state flag. And I'll never forget the day when my best friends stopped being my friends and started being white. And it split up our community, and I remember my teacher raising the Confederate flag in class and saying, "This will always be our flag." I remember the pickup trucks with the Confederate flag waving in the cold stairs, and a white supremacist folk singer named Johnny Rebel being played on the school bus by classmates. And so today when I heard about the killing in Charleston, you know, I was obviously devastated by what took place inside the church and having such a blatant form of white supremacy hit close to home. I grew up in the black church. But then the second tragedy that hit me was the idea of having a Confederate flag raised at half-mast in South Carolina. And I think that that really, for me, symbolizes the battle between the future and the past. And the fact that no matter how hard we try as young people in this country to escape from the past and to break ties with it, we are constantly reminded that we can't do it. And it reminds me of a quote from Winston Churchill, I think, that said, "The farther backward you can look, the farther forward you can see." And I want to talk a little bit about what movement leaders on the ground are telling us about the future. And I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties, go figure. I'm the millennial on the call and having trouble getting able to see the slides moving. But what I'll do is just kind of read out what slide I'm on, and if you all can switch with me. So Black Youth and the Progressive Future. We saw in 2008 and 2012 rock star turnout from African American youth across the spectrum, despite the media narrative that black youth are apathetic. And similar to what Ludovic said, when we talk about young people in this country being more progressive than previous generations, it is unquestionably because of African American youth, Latino youth, but in particular black female youth. And so I put some numbers there. You can see 18 to 29 black females in 2012 turned out and voted for President Obama at 98%, and have carried the water really for the progressive movement in a lot of ways that haven't been expressed. Next slide. But one of the things that happened after that election in 2014, we had the lowest turnout in the country since World War II, as everybody on this call knows. And it happened at a time where there was also massive black protests taking place around the country, which I'll talk a little bit about. And what that indicates to me is that there's really not a question when we talk about black voting in this moment whether or not black youth are apathetic. The question is whether or not they see their passions and their dreams being reflected in our representative democracy. And so that gap, you know, the killing of Michael Brown happening literally months before the midterm election, and seeing, you know, mobilizations across the country not reflected at the ballot box, I think, calls into question for us whether or not today's movement leaders believe, or we believe, that change is possible at the ballot box. And there are a lot of reasons that you hear from folks, you know, and you see some of them there. You know, nobody keeps their promises. No one listens to our concerns. Nothing really changes in our economics. And so therefore, maybe we should vote for nobody and have that represented. I think the big question for folks to think about, particularly funders, is this just a moment of generational change where younger people will eventually grow out of the disconnect between mobilization and representative democracy, or are we actually living through a crisis in representative democracy, which is to say, is there a shift in the way people experience and aspire to have their voices heard? And the rise of the internet, I think, raises that. And so I just want to put that in folks' heads as we go to the next slide, which is titled Decentralized Movements. So the piece about living through a crisis in representative democracy, one indicator that this may be the case, which is around the world, we've seen movement moments. And we saw one here in the United States over the last year. And by movement moments, I mean moments of heightened political civic activity, often expressed through nonviolent action as well as spontaneous rebellion. And what attracts young black people to these moments are many of the frustrations that 50 years ago, when the young people from SNCC grew tired of only the sit-ins, shifted to a more voter engagement strategy, civic engagement, and Freedom Summer. Those same frustrations are now, in a way, being expressed through movement moments. And we all know about Black Lives Matter, about the protests in Ferguson and Baltimore and elsewhere around the country. The defining characteristics of these movement moments, which are important for civic engagement funders who are interested in harnessing the power of black participation, should focus on, are really the decentralized nature of these protests. Before I came into the funding space with SEIU, and one of the big questions I asked the president of SEIU was, why were young people so active in Occupy? It shared the same values as the union, but they weren't active in the union. And the same can be asked of black civic engagement. And so decentralized structures, they have low barriers to entry. Anyone can go to join Black Lives Matter. Anyone can tweet the hashtag. They also are leaderful movements as opposed to leaderless movements, where there isn't leadership isn't a title in these movement moments, but it is indicated of people who lead, which often opens spaces for women and queer folks who aren't seeing themselves represented in other forms of civic participation to find their voice. And all of us know the story, the beautiful story of the 3 women behind the Black Lives Matter hashtag. And then online activism, the mainstream media was a major target of the mobilization tactics in the 1960s when Dr. King led the March on Selma. They targeted mainstream media through direct confrontation, et cetera, et cetera. But today, the tools of online persuasion and organizing have essentially allowed young black people to circumvent mainstream media and have their stories told. And this is highly significant because it's arguable that without the internet, the open and free internet, we wouldn't know the names of Michael Brown, or we wouldn't know the names of Freddie Gray had they not been caught on tape and or pictures taken and spread. Next slide, which is going to read centralized institutions. I have to preface this by saying that it's dangerous to think about decentralized as being good and centralized as being bad, which is usually the way people interpret these, because the Ku Klux Klan was highly decentralized. And there are good forces that are centralized. And so I'm drawing these distinctions to help us as funders really think about the dynamics at play. And so we know that the traditional black civic engagement infrastructure has been centralized. And by that, it has a dedicated staff, title leadership, folks with prominent roles and titles, often with connection to prominent media figures, political figures, et cetera. And then there's an inside strategy where people are trying to move their agenda through the Democratic Party, through the political process, whatever those representative institutions are, that's the strategy in centralized structures. And so the choice, as I kind of wind down here, I think for funders today who are interested in how we harness the energy and power of the Black Lives Matter protest movement and other expressions of black youth participation, is whether we ignore the fact that there are 2 forms living side by side, that there is in some way tension inherent between movements and institutions. And our choice is whether we ignore it and we believe that this is somewhat of a passing phase of youthfulness that will one day leave, which I think may actually be a shift in how black people, period, are viewing democracy. If we choose to ignore it, I think we'll suffer. If we choose to understand it and manage the polarity, I think we can win. And that goes to the next slide, which talks about integrated structures. So talking about the past and the present and the future, all of us have a DNA. And that allows us to look like our grandparents and our great-grandparents and et cetera, without much conscious choice. And I use the analogy of DNA to describe what I think funders should be looking for as we seek to kind of bridge this divide between centralized and decentralized methods of Black civic participation. And the kind of DNA I think we should begin to look for, which already exists in movement leaders, are screaming this for us to pay attention to. That DNA includes a core leadership team, a central command but decentralized component, a strong meta-narrative and brand, training and education capacity, online organizing, and being volunteer-driven. And to give a perfect example of what this looks like in practice is the Black Youth Project 100. Black Youth Project 100 quickly was formed after the death of Trayvon Martin, and his death kind of catalyzed massive protests across the country. And in Chicago, the Black Youth Project was formed right after the Zimmerman verdict. And they have a core leadership team and formed an organization with Charlene Carruthers and others at the steer there. They have a central command, but they have affiliate groups all over the country that allow them to kind of be localized even as they are national. And they have a very strong meta-narrative and brand that's part of this larger Black Lives Matter, developing a lot of leaders. And of course, Black Youth Project has also been very highly skilled in the online organizing, and they have staff, but they're mostly volunteer. And you might say, well, how does all this activism matter for voting? In 2014, they channeled the energy and frustration with the death of Mike Brown into a robust civic engagement project in Illinois, Michigan, and North Carolina, and were very quickly able to partner with state voices tables in those 3 states to identify where there were Black youth in the youth who were not being talked to and were not included, and they targeted them and had very successful voter registration, education, and turnout associated with it. Last slide, which is called recommendations. Very simply, I think that for funders who want to narrow this divide and invest in a more integrated approach that brings movements and institutions closer together for Black political and civic participation, we need to be somewhat experimental, because DNA is about self-replication, but it also means taking the time to identify where those opportunities are. And it took time for Black Youth Project. It will take time for others to emerge out of the Black Lives Matter. So we want to make those grants in an experimental way that tries to invest in the right DNA. And then secondly, campuses across this country in the fall, this coming fall, young Black folks who've been angry and frustrated and protesting are going to come back to campus and say, how do we continue this momentum? One way is to start training and education and investing in that work now so that they see the link between movement and civic engagement. And then the final piece, I think, is using the historic nature of the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act to lift up the story of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The fact that young people, just like the Black youth in the streets risking their lives today, did the same thing 50 years ago in places like Mississippi and Alabama and California. And because of their actions, they were able to win a significant milestone that opened up democratic possibility for today's generation. And I think the only people who can tell that story powerfully in a compelling way are the veterans of SNCC. And they are planning, I believe, at Duke University this summer, a conference to talk about the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And I think funders should think about how do we help get as many young activists as possible, tickets, whatever it takes, so that they can interact with these veterans. And I'll close by saying one quick short story, which is talking with a SNCC veteran, Cortland Cox, not too long ago. He remarked to me how he had a conversation with Tom Hayden when he was in his when Cortland was in his early 20s. And Tom Hayden said, brother, you are so young. You really don't know much about how this movement works. And Cortland is now in his 80s, and he looks back and he says, if I had known what I knew now back in the 1960s when I was 22, I would have done things differently. And so the question that I put to funders about youth, black youth civic participation is, what kinds of experiences could movement leaders get now that take 50 years of experience and condense it into 5 years or 3 years? What kinds of trainings, what kinds of opportunities could we be investing in for that learning curve to be expedited in a way that builds long-term and short-term power?
Austin, that was fantastic, and I want to thank the entire panelists for your thoughts and your views. Before we open up the gates to the questions from the panel, or to the panel from the internet, I want to just ask a few questions, if I may, as moderator, to the panelists. One, Ludovic, you started us off talking about the numbers, and it was something that kind of existed throughout the various presentations. You know, the numbers matter. It looks like, quote unquote, the numbers may actually be on our side. But I also know a lot that the number game is also being played on the quote unquote opposition as well, that also sees these numbers as an opportunity to engage or enhance their own political interest and issues. So my question to you, Ludovic, is actually, how do you put progressive politics to the numbers? We can always, you know, we've all heard the number, the demographics are shifting, more people of color, but how do we also ensure that that generation that is emerging actually has the progressive values that we're looking for? My second question is to Keisha. Excellent overview of VRA and where we are with a whole host of rights and policy analysis. And my question for you, Keisha, is around, do we know enough about public support around enhanced access for voting? Sometimes I wonder if these conversations are a little bit too internal, but do we actually know that the public is actually engaged in our civic conversations? And if so, like, if you've seen particular spaces that we could actually mirror, or how do we actually get this information, quote unquote, to the masses, right? The folks who are actually going to be mobilized. And lastly, I want to go to Austin. Austin, you talked about in your recommendations the notion of experimental grants. And I'm really curious to just press a little bit more about, so when we say experimental grants, what would that look like? And more importantly, how would funders have to rethink what we're already programmed to think and act like? Does that make sense? Because you put out a lot of ideas around innovation, but I'm just curious, from the funder side, how do we respond to that kind of innovation? Like, foundations oftentimes are not the most nimble of institutions. So Ludovic, if you could go first, followed by Keisha and Austin, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A, and I can also repeat any of these questions just in case I spoke too fast. So Ludovic.
Sure, I'll take the crack. In my presentation, I tried to combine the numbers and the ideology. How we handle it is with the knowledge that actually the Progressive Coalition is not the white liberal folks in parts of Brooklyn, California, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. That is not the majority of the Progressive Coalition, even though that is the disproportionate majority of the funded left infrastructure. The numbers are such that the progressive voting population is largely people of color, and in that case it's actually largely women of color. And so we need to norm that actually the engagement and outreach program, the regular one needs to be targeting women of color and especially black women. The minority outreach program needs to target white folks. So we need to rejigger the way that we think of the Progressive Coalition, center people of color, and within that really center women of color and black women in particular. If we do that, we will actually align our infrastructure, our progressive infrastructure, with where the numbers are. Lastly, when you look at what the policy preferences are of people of color, they are actually progressive. And I think, I don't know if you sent out that link, but a recent research study was done that white folks' support for public policy is an inverse relationship to the extent to which people of color support that policy. And so, so a large part of the white electorate is actually reacting against what they perceive to be in the best interest of people of color. And so we need to stop chasing those, quote, white swing voters and start working towards what is actually the base. And to pivot off what Austin said, not just asking them to vote, but actually giving them real reasons to vote, which means that when we win, we actually do good things. And so we make voting matter. The right definitely makes voting matter. The left is not clear when our folks win whether we make voting worth it.
Thank you. Keisha, my question to you around increasing public support and knowledge.
Sure. You know, that's a real question, a real challenge. Of course, it's a real question. It's also a real challenge. As we think about questions of public support and civic engagement, what we do know is that in terms of public support, people believe that voting is both a right and a privilege, that there is some sentiment around not making it, quote unquote, too easy. But at the end of the day, there is a general sentiment that government shouldn't make it more difficult, that having requirements for identification doesn't bother people, but certainly people do get agitated and really start to dislike some of these rules when they believe that these rules are being put in place by requiring identification that people don't have. For example, in Texas, the voter ID law permits use of a driver's license, passport, a couple different forms of state-issued ID, including a concealed carry gun license, but not IDs from the University of Texas or other state institutions that are targeted around young people. So there's clearly a divide in terms of how these laws are written, in terms of cherry-picking who can access the polls. So much of the work, there's some research that was done jointly by the Brennan Center for Justice and the Advancement Project back in 2012 that tells us that people do care about these issues. People want to see poll access. They want to see reasonable poll access. And the other thing that's important is the more access you give people, they don't want to see retrenchment. So where we've seen states that have mail voting, that have early voting, people don't like to see those opportunities leave once they're in place. So how do you move from the idea of saying these are sort of like policy wonky research questions to fundamental questions of access, and just as important as having a right to cast a ballot, when you do it, where you do it, how you do it, makes a difference to whether or not your community is able to leverage these opportunities. I think it's to the heart of your question. And we don't know enough, I don't believe, about what specific tools or levers are able to help people kind of access the vote. I think that a lot of Austin's comments around whether or not voting generally is really capturing hearts and minds. Do people understand or relate to why voting should matter, and whether or not voting in fact does matter? And so I think there's a lot of interconnected with all the comments made today, that as we think about these as solutions, these are only solutions to the extent we can activate people around the underlying issues that relate to our representative democracy.
Excellent. Austin, the question around experimental grants. I know that you're newly minted to the philanthropic sector, so welcome. Just really curious to know, how do you think foundations should respond to these experimental treatments for grants?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's knowing the right kinds of questions to ask. Like, for example, one of the questions that I would be asking is, what are the best practices for recruiting younger Americans to attend some of the training programs that Ludovic talked about earlier to be potential candidates? And that question makes sense for C3 civic engagement funders, because all of the research indicates that one of the major reasons that people aren't excited about linking movements to political or civic participation is because they're not seeing their values reflected in candidates. And so how do we start to learn more about what that looks like is one question. Secondly, we're all interested in voter participation. And so some of the messaging from the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, is very strong. And so what would it look like to kind of have issue campaigns or political campaigns with strongly worded messages of threats that are unique to young black voters, and to kind of see how that mobilizes them to register and vote. So could we draw those connections to say, actually, these are the messages you should go on? And then I think there's more to that research agenda. So I think the first piece is kind of having a research agenda that you can begin to talk to folks in foundations or with individual donors about that might excite them, because I just don't think people are having the conversation. And then secondly, I think it's understanding networks and how they work as places for shared learning and growth that don't require a lot of money. So for example, there's going to be a conference of the Movement for Black Lives in July. The Black Lives Matter conference, I think, is going on now. It just happened. And those aren't coalitions that funders are comfortable with, and they're not organizations that organizations are comfortable with. Networks are something different, something more vibrant that allow that to happen. And funding convenings that kind of live at the intersection of powerful black organizing networks is another way I think that we could help invest in experimentation that isn't directly a grant to one organization. And then finally, I think, pooled funds that are dedicated to experimentation offer opportunities to take a little bit more risk, to ask questions that look for metrics that are maybe a little bit more multi-layered. For example, I talked to a funder recently who's just interested in voter registration, and I tried to talk to the funder about what if it's possible that people would register if they were excited about something, if they believed in something. And so I think that pooled funds sometimes can make those investments in a way that C3 funders have a little bit more space and can also get deliverables on the key metrics that they're accountable to.
Thank you. Bianca, I wondered if you had a series of questions from online that you could share with the panel.
Hi, Alvin, I do, and the first question is for Austin. What are some suggestions you would make for black youth who have turned their backs on politics? What have you seen to support this contradiction of that viewpoint?
I think talking to our grandparents, if they're living, or people of that generation is number one. Storytelling is really the glue of movement building. And I think that we don't have enough, we don't do it enough to just sit down and tell the story of what life was like in the middle of the 20th century. My grandmother has worked at the polls every single year since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And it's hard for me to look her in the eye and with all that I've been able to do and say, I don't really understand why you go and volunteer there, Grandma. And vice versa, she understands me having been arrested multiple times for no other reason than being black, the unfinished work that has to be done. And so I think, in short, you're not going to lecture or explain to young people why it's important to vote. I think it's through the storytelling and the transmission of values across generation and telling the legacy of the civil rights movement that we may be able to bridge that divide.
Thank you, Austin, for that answer. The next question I have here is for Keisha. Where do you see the biggest challenges with the VRA?
The biggest challenges with the okay, so there's sort of two questions. If we're talking about the VRA in terms of the pending federal legislation, it's simply a lack of political will on the right and the left in Congress to prioritize this legislation. And so it's just really very much an uphill battle in that respect. As we think about the ability of what sort of the remaining portions of the Voting Rights Act, where are we with Section 2? There certainly are some questions and certainly some indication from the court that there may be some constitutionality questions even with Section 2. And so that remains a question. The ability to be able to support the litigation efforts, there really is not enough resources being pushed towards those organizations defending that work, and there's at least one. There is at least one donor collaborative that's very much focused on this work, but there certainly does need to be more. But I would say right now the biggest threat to the Voting Rights Act is whether or not we're going to see another constitutional challenge under the Section 2.
Thank you for that, Keisha. I have another question, and any of the panelists are welcome to answer it. The question is, where do you find the best nonpartisan information on the VRA, the VRAA, or any political action, political movements happening in general?
This is Keisha. At the end of my slide presentation, I think I identified, a number of organizations, all of which who have put out really good factual information, particularly the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, the Brennan Center for Justice, and the ACLU Voting Rights team over there, I think are particularly good for getting information around what's happening with voting rights, what's happening in the community, and particularly around pending legislation and the work related to that, and certainly Project Vote and FELN around pending legislation around voting rights and voting opportunities to expand the ballot. So those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head that relate to VRA and ballot access information.
Thank you for that, Keisha. Did anyone else have any thoughts on that subject or where they go for information? If you're on mute, take your phone off.
I'm just kidding. I was joking saying Twitter, but no.
And this is Ludwig. I'd say FCCP, the Funders Collaborative on Civic Participation, is a good place to find out about a variety of the work that needs to be done.
I had another set of questions that I wanted to throw out to the panel, if I may. In preparing for this conversation, you kind of go through the news and the news cycles and print media, and there seems to be, I don't know if it's a new phrase, but at least a phrase that I've seen in 3 prominent papers, and it refers to black voters, and the phrase is Obama apathy. And just wondering your comments about that. And underneath this is the idea, and it goes back to something that Austin was pointing out, giving individuals something to vote for. The underlining statements in these articles were that black people had voted for a black candidate with the aspirations of seeing either significant changes in their own personal lives. And so now with the upcoming presidential elections, how do people of both parties, multiple parties, start to mobilize what they think will be an apathetic community? Kind of like this, the influence of, since Obama did not take care of these things, do people believe that the new candidates will? So I would love to hear, your thoughts about that. And these are just terminologies by, quick-witted journalists, but is it real?
Well, black voter turnout was quite high, both black men and black women in the 2 Obama elections. And even in the midterms, it wasn't so much that the black turnout went down, it was that white turnout went up. So I think there's two questions. One is whether there's Obama fatigue, meaning people voted and didn't get the change that they thought. I think that is partially true. The other reality is that whether on the partisan side or those of us who fund nonpartisan voter engagement work, we would be fools to think that after 2 presidential cycles of having a black person with a black family who seemed to like black people running for president and winning, that we will assume that black folks will turn out at the same numbers in future presidential campaigns, essentially for free. So I think that is a fool's errand, and we need to make sure that we invest in ways that increase black voter turnout and increase the power that happens when we do turn out.
Thank you. Austin or Keisha, any reflections on that question?
I think, just really quickly, I think that is a good question, and Ludovic answered it perfectly better than I would have. But I can say the other thing to think about is it's Obama, but it's about the state itself and how black people relate to the state. And I mean state in the sense of like government, not in the sense of individual 50 states. Many of the young people today, particularly those who are active, are divided about the question of whether or not the state is a vehicle that you can express your desire for change through, or is the state something that itself must dissolve before those dreams can be expressed? And if this was a marginal conversation, I might be less apt to raise it, but I actually think in many communities of movement leaders, this is a real debate. And Obama is a perfect example, and there's a real divide over when President Obama made an announcement about historical systemic racism and policing in Baltimore. Some saw that as really him trying to divert the anger and outrage of young black people aimed at the state, and then others saw it as a positive sign that the state in some way might be evolving. So I think that question is going to play itself out in the midst of this conversation about the legacy of the Obama quote-unquote voters.
This is Keisha. I think the comments made are absolutely correct. I would like to comment a bit on the questions around media and media portrayal around the black vote in and of itself, and sort of devolving it to a question of pro-Obama or anti-Obama. The fact is, we know that despite not being the African-American population not being part of what is being commonly termed the rising American electorate, black women in particular are the highest performing electorate and have been for years. The idea that whether or not African Americans are going to vote, whether or not they're going to continue to vote, and tying it solely to whether or not to the relationship between a single candidate, I think misses the mark in terms of how we should be talking and thinking about how African Americans specifically engage in political action. What does it mean? Certainly, Obama's election certainly raised participation across the board, whether it was youth vote, African American vote, but the overall and consistent performance of African American voters over time cannot and should not be sort of devolved into a question of whether or not the relationship solely between African Americans and President Obama. And it is my hope that we continue to think much more broadly about these questions and not allow the media to define this work, to define the vote and the work that needs to be done in this very narrow way.
Thank you. So I know that we're going to be wrapping up, but we wanted to also provide closing comments from the panelists. So we'll follow our already existing program. Well, we'll just go in reverse. We'll start with Austin, then we'll go. No, let's flip it up even more. We'll start with Keisha, then we'll go to Austin, then Ludovic, just to offer your closing comments or even a reference to further information for those of us who are still on the webinar. So Keisha, can you give us your closing comments?
Sure. Again, thank you all for allowing me to share this time and thoughts on what is really an increasingly important question around ballot and ballot access. I believe that as we think about particularly affirmative opportunities to expand access to the ballot and expand opportunities to vote, as we think about coalitions and coalition work, particularly in terms of funding, another way to think about strategies that I don't know that we think about enough is rather than necessarily directly funding or encouraging organizations to fund in sort of a broad way, but to actually allow some re-granting power directly through organizations that are focused in POC populations and African American populations specifically, to actually be able to leverage these organizations through the biggest tool we have as grant makers, which of course are financial resources, and to be able to leverage those opportunities very directly and very swiftly by essentially raising the profile and forcing organizations that work not only with POC populations but more broadly to the table with these organizations with more control and more power over the conversation, direction, and strategy. I think it's going to be a real interesting opportunity to think about how we can think about funding work on the ground. And incredibly important in this area where community engagement and outreach and the challenges that have been defined by all the speakers today really are best told, best understood by the leadership with these organizations. So it's my hope that we leverage not just by directly funding the work, but by actually using some of the dollars that we have available to us as grant makers to actually start expanding the power and position of these organizations within local communities as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Austin, your final comments for this panel?
Yes. I think that we're in a really, really unique moment in history, and we've seen the last year, and plus I actually think a lot of this started with Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath, and the lie that systemic racism no longer exists in the United States being broken in front of nationally televised audience back then. And the protests, I think, are going to continue and intensify. But what remains to be seen, I think, is whether or not the tension between movements and institutions and civic participation is kind of bridged, that divide is bridged. And in this moment, it's the time to answer that question. It's not an intellectual conversation that academics and funders have. I think movement leaders are going to, on the ground, have to resolve some of these tensions and talk about a way forward. And concretely, I think the way to do that is to support as much as possible alliance building opportunities like the network convening of Black Lives Matter movement for Black Lives happening in July. I think it's doubling down on voter education and leadership development, things that don't tend to get funded all the time, and then making key investments in organizations like the Black Youth Project, which have the right DNA and with the resource support that they need could help us win in the short term, and most importantly, help us win a progressive future in the medium and long term.
Thank you. Ludovic, your final comments.
I'm 43 and I've seen, 44 actually, and I've seen historic moments come and go. And so I feel like this is an opportunity, not the only opportunity, but the opportunity of now to take advantage of the opening that mostly devastating things, that fantastic people's responses to devastating things have opened up. And I agree, we both need to fund the movement work, which is Black Lives Matter and a variety of the other manifestations of that, as well as ensuring that we're building the longer-term infrastructure that can sustain movement gains, and that work needs to be both defensive and proactive. It needs to be both at the federal level and at the state and sub-state level, and it needs to be as unrestrictive as possible, both in terms of general operating support as well as making sure that we're encouraging some of the key groups to take their 501h elections so that they can do a variety of different kinds of work. Lastly, I think that what that means is that funders need to be collaborating amongst ourselves to make sure we are sharing our understanding of the landscape, building a common analysis, building a common strategy, and then building an aligned funding strategy. And we also need to be in touch with the practitioners who are doing the same. Now is a key time to be doing that.
Thank you. So again, on behalf of the panel and myself and ABFE, I want to say thank you for joining us, and I want to turn the microphone over to Edward Jones.
Thank you, Alvin, and thanks to all of you. This is such a timely conversation, and even as we know that the Voting Rights Act anniversary is coming up, we know there's also the major elections coming up locally and on the national landscape, and this is such a critical part of our civic engagement. And I even remember, I think Austin, you talked a little bit about the early experience of your voting, and I remember my first voting experience and looking forward to it. And I think we need to get everyone back to that mode of looking forward to voting and really knowing what's going on in the electorate and in the election process. So thanks for sharing this information. Of course, everyone, we appreciate your joining this and hope the conversation continues by using Black Vote Matters, that hashtag, and look forward to getting information in our Knowledge Center at abfe.org, where we will post this webinar as well as resources that have been shared by these great folks on the call, as well as other information that does come to us to uplift this discussion and engage folks so that we can really get to the heart of the issues that mean most to us in such a critical time, particularly at the federal and state and local levels. So you'll get a webinar survey from us, and we invite you to fill it out. It helps give us ample information so that we can create the best experiences for you. And until the next time we come together, actually, there's going to be a special webinar coming up that I want to make sure you all keep on the lookout for. We will share through social media. The final date is being confirmed, and so invite you to join us on the third Thursdays when we do those, but as well as other interim special webinars like one that's coming up in the next couple of weeks. So be mindful and keep voting. Take care.
Thank you.